What's up, everybody? This is Kevin.
This is Ryan.
And this is Becca.
And you're listening to the GenSTEM podcast.
The one and only STEM podcast.
For young professionals.
By young professionals.
Join in on our free-flowing conversations.
Where we break down all things STEM.
In an easy, fun, and digestible way.
We are
Generation STEM.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Generation STEM. I've got Kevin and Ryan here for a quick intro to let you know about what this episode is on this week. We're really excited about both the guest, the startup, and the technology that we're going to be discussing. And so I'll let Kevin and Ryan give a little more background info about what you're going to be hearing in the interview today.
Wow, thanks, Becca. Great introduction. So, yeah, like Becca said,
that's Kevin being sassy because Kevin's usually the one bringing us in. So I think he's a little jealous that he let me take the staff today.
Yeah, I let you. You demanded you take it from me. Anyways, as Becca mentioned, we've got a great interview over Novo Nutrients, and we're going to be interviewing the CEO of this company, David Tze. So last fall, Ryan and I were able to go to a demonstration of this Black & Veatch IgniteX cleantech program where it was a program that Black & Veatch started that invited startups from around the country to come. They went through a 30-day workshop, and at the end they presented. And Novo Nutrients was one of the companies, and we were able to get into contact with David Tze as well as a couple other companies. If you remember, we already did an episode, I think maybe like a couple episodes ago, on ecospheres and how they're cleaning up the environment and chemicals from the soils. Well, along the same lines, Novo Nutrients is doing their part in bringing a disruptive clean technology, which Ryan will explain a little bit more in detail here.
Yeah, so like Kevin said, the reason that we thought it was like so disruptive and kind of cool is that recently, as we all know, carbon emissions, CO2 has been a big environmental concern presently, but also going forward. So if you think about all these industrial facilities that produce large amounts of CO2, like coal-fired generation facilities, refineries, all that stuff, they're producing large amounts of CO2. And what Novo Nutrients and David's company is looking at doing is essentially capturing those CO2 emissions, the effluent gas that's a byproduct of energy creation, and combining the CO2 with hydrogen. So they combine the CO2 and the hydrogen into a gas bioreactor, and the environment that's created is called a microbial consortium, which essentially is you could think about it as a greenhouse for microbes. So these microbes, small bacteria, feed on the combination of the CO2 and the hydrogen, and this fermentation process takes place within this gas bioreactor. And the byproduct of that whole environment is a protein. And what really is cool, because Becca will touch on it in a minute, but kind of killing two birds with one stone, you're taking CO2 out of the air, but the byproduct is just as useful as kind of taking it out of the air, because this protein is used in fish feed, fish powder. And I really didn't realize how large the fish industry is as a whole, because, I always think I'm eating fresh caught fish. It's from the lakes of, not Ozarks, because that's probably not the freshest fish in the world, but it's fresh fish. But that's not really the case. A lot of the food we eat comes from fish farms, and so current practice right now is essentially to feed these fish. And these are stats that Novo Nutrients kind of provided on their website. But typically, what they do is this fish industry will capture roughly 300 billion little fish each year, and those
that's
fish
with a B.
B with the B, not million. 300 billion little fish each year.
Jeez.
And they grind up those fish and create pretty much the same protein powder. And they feed it to these larger fish that are within fish farms. And so you think about all the extra waste that's just created to create that byproduct of the same powder that Novo Nutrients is trying to create. So that obviously gives you the scale of the size of market there is. So what Novo Nutrients is trying to do is essentially take their byproduct, which is just as nutritious as grinding up all these small little fish.
I'm gonna start saying that as like the shortened the like nickname for saying nutritious. Oh, that's so nutritious.
Just as nutritious. So yeah, they pretty much take all of that, and they think they can create, just from one large cement plant, that could create about $3 billion worth of this protein product. Yeah. So that's kind of the big why on what they're doing. They're taking CO2, combining with hydrogen, letting bacteria feed on it, and the byproduct is fish protein powder that essentially would be used for fish farms.
And it's not just Black & Veatch who has invested in Novo Nutrients, on a smaller scale at this point. I mean, now Novo Nutrients has a deal with Chevron, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. If you've filled up your car with gas, you've probably heard of the company Chevron before. But they're planning on implementing this stuff, in a larger scale by next year. And like Ryan mentioned, I just find it incredibly fascinating and innovative to talk to somebody who has created a technology that solves not just one but multiple problems, right? You're minimizing the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted to the atmosphere, which is, a huge problem that we're trying to fix globally right now. Taking that byproduct and then processing it into something that can be utilized to sustainably feed fish. It's crazy. And I don't know about you guys, but I found just the conversation with David really fascinating because he is so passionate about a lot of really big picture problems such as global warming and then also world hunger as well, because I think ultimately, he wants to be creating a product that is going to generate more food and make food more accessible for communities across the world, including third world countries. And not only that, he's just so technically educated on all of this stuff as well. So we're excited for you guys to listen in to his insights and his knowledge, because I know that we walked away with an incredible amount of new facts and knowledge that we didn't have going into it.
100%. And, just jumping on the whole world hunger is, I don't know about you, but when I started engineering and when my interest in the STEM world kind of peaked, I went to camps, and like the biggest problem in all those camps was 2050. We're going to have, 20 billion people. How are we going to feed them? How are we going to provide them with, adequate water, food supplies, earth, and an environment that can sustain life with that many people in the world? His product is like literally taking waste that wouldn't be here without, or I guess it probably would be here, but, waste that we create, turning it into a food to, as Becca mentioned, create a cheaper food supply. I mean, the basic elements that are going into the fish, like the proteins that the fish are eating, is exactly the same as if you were to harvest live fish, but you're not having to kill 300 billion fish. You can replace that with literally waste. Yeah. And I just think that's incredible.
Right. You're not disrupting the food chain either, because that's part of it too. But you're totally right.
And the one thing he mentioned that I think is a really cool nugget, if you listen towards the end, this isn't just a fish food product. Eventually this can expand beyond fish to, most of the food we eat, most of the proteins we eat other proteins and eat other animals. Instead of having to waste, for lack of a better term, waste other animals feeding our food, we can just develop this protein for them. And
it's the whole saying, live to eat versus eat to live. It's the whole eat to live, where you only need to consume the nutrients and the products that you really need. It's kind of making a more efficient consumption of what you eat and how you eat it with, what's more sustainable long term. And he'll touch on it in the interview, but what I thought was really interesting too was he has this well thought out take, but how eventually he believes the human race is going to go more towards the vegetarian type of diet. And he thinks kind of the next step in that is eating more fish than meat, whether it's chicken or red meat. He thinks just with the supply that's out there versus the demand and the cost of red meat or chicken, that he thinks fish maybe become kind of the next step to human vegetarianism, which I thought was an interesting take coming from me who likes eating his
big boy
guy.
Eats steak.
Yeah.
With that being said, we hope you guys learn as much as we did during this interview, and we'll turn it over to the interview.
We are here today with David Tze, CEO of Novo Nutrients. Welcome, David. Good to be here.
Can you kind of give us the why do we care pitch, or what's the fish food problem, and then what's the CO2 problem, and how are you solving both of them?
Yeah, so seafood is the biggest animal protein category globally. It's bigger than pork, it's bigger than chicken, it's bigger than beef. And about half of all seafood today is farmed. And it'll, over time, that fraction will increase as the pie gets larger for seafood to be 2/3 to 3/4 farmed. This is important for two reasons. One is the growth of the farm seafood is unsustainable given primarily the inputs that it requires today. And so if you could broaden the range of usable inputs, you can solve the sustainability problem and allow the industry to grow where it otherwise might not, and also to grow without doing significant damage to the ocean ecosystems and other ecosystems. The second reason why it's important is because the fish that people like to eat and the shrimp tend to be carnivores. And carnivores are, as you can imagine, if you think about, Tiger King, difficult to feed, right? You need to feed them other animals, which are the most expensive thing you can feed anything. And so it's a difficult technical problem to find a way to create proteins that are animal-like, but don't come from an animal. And, the soy industry has tried to do it with mixed success, but we think that the big weapon in the arsenal are microbes, and particularly bacteria. Unlike microalgae or yeast, bacteria have or can have a very animal-like protein structure. The amino acids, the building blocks of proteins have a certain profile, so they can either be more or less like animals or more or less like plants, to greatly simplify. And the bacteria that we use are incredibly animal-like, and in fact, we've chosen them because they mimic the amino acid profile of the most commonly used nutritional protein animal, which is the Peruvian anchovy. So the country of Peru has been blessed with an incredible fishery that produces about 75% of the internationally traded fish protein flour, which is rendered from these anchovies. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons why aquaculture as part of seafood is so important, and why this particular problem within aquaculture is, to my mind, the most pressing one, and then the most quantitatively significant one, and why we've chosen to address it, but why it also is merely the opening gambit and the demonstration for producing this very high value bulk protein that can then be applied with different slight tweaks to all the other nutritional markets. From 2004 to 2016, I managed a venture capital fund, a seed fund for aquaculture, so investing in fish farming companies, and to a greater extent the technology and services companies that support fish farming or are upstream or downstream from fish farms on the value chain. And unlike other companies I've been involved with, this group had an incredibly ambitious and promising source of carbon for their nutrient generation process, and that was industrial emissions of CO2. And that really blew my mind. It was not something I had ever considered as possible. And so that started a half-year process of mutual evaluation. It turned out that this company was really a biofuels company that was starting to pivot towards nutrition. And so they were looking for leadership that had experience in that sector. And I was looking for a technology that I thought had sort of a near universal application to aquaculture. What I've learned in the year since is that, to a great extent, protein is protein. There are different levels of quality and characteristics, but protein that's good enough for fish is more than good enough for dogs, cats, people, chickens, pigs. And so these types of technologies, and particularly Novo Nutrients approach, has application across really all of animal nutrition and human nutrition. And so there are giant opportunities for me to learn not just about fish, which is what I've been doing since 2004, but in the past, since 2017, I've been learning about these other areas of nutrition as well. And we're hoping to make a splash there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we'll move into asking you kind of like what the future goals of Novo Nutrients is down the road. But at this point, in layman's terms, just to kind of spark notes what you described, Novo Nutrients essentially is a company that utilizes a technology, a carbon capture technology, and captures carbon from industrial facilities that have carbon emissions, and through some sort of process of which I'm sure we'll go into more detail about, can convert it into proteins that are good enough to be fed to fish, right?
Yeah, that's basically what we do. I mean, we really see it as it's a biomanufacturing platform, which is a fancy way to say that, we can make stuff using biology instead of using a traditional factory. The biology we use is microbial, primarily bacterial. And so in a certain sense, there are three parts of what we do. Hardware, what's the steel that we put in the ground that conducts particularly the fermentation process? Wetware, what's the biology? What are the exact species and strains of microbes that we use? And then finally, there is a software component, which is largely around sensors and controls, because getting the system to work together requires some additional, logic that isn't available off the shelf.
David, what you've mentioned so far is that the way that you guys have been capturing CO2 is through industrial applications. Can you kind of describe how that works, and like why have you targeted industrial versus just capturing it from the air? Going outside with a glass jar and just saying, "Gotcha, CO2." There you go.
Money. It's probably costs $1,000 a ton to capture it from air today. Everyone hopes that someday that will get down to $50 a ton, but it's not there today. Whereas industrial CO2, people should be paying us to take it, although our financial models conservatively assume that we pay them a little bit.
Okay.
And if you think about the science behind it, it's because there's only 400 parts per million CO2 in the air. It's a tiny fraction of the air relative to things like nitrogen, oxygen, and it's enough to cause huge problems because of the way that the climate works and the greenhouse effect. But if you go to an ethanol plant, you're getting close to 100% CO2 out of those emissions. You go to a cement plant, you're getting significant CO2. And so it's like, why do you rob a bank? That's where the money is. You get CO2 from the sources where it's most prevalent. You don't want to spend a tremendous amount of energy extracting a tiny amount of CO2 from air.
So then do you put like some type of mechanism or something on top of a stack of these industrial facilities to like reroute that CO2 emissions to your processing facility, or how do you guys kind of capture that CO2?
So the great news in this area is that a lot of people have been working on so-called carbon capture, right? It's not something that we have to invent. It's fairly easy to divert these streams before they end up in the flue stack, before they get into the atmosphere. And then the question becomes, how much purity of CO2 does one need? So there are some processes where they need 100% pure CO2. That would be particularly something like CO2 for beverages. So if you're a Coca-Cola bottling company and distributor, you want beverage grade close to 100% pure CO2 without impurities. One of the strengths of our technology is we don't need 100% CO2. We can take many of these industrial gases as they are with a plurality or majority CO2 content, and still use it without expending all the additional CapEx and OpEx to purify out a stream that's 100%, 99%, or even 90% pure. And so given that there are 40 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide, ton equivalent greenhouse gases emitted, we really, in a certain sense, have our pick of which ones we want to address, because we're not, we don't need to be in the business of making 20 billion tons a year of protein products, which would be approximately the amount that we could make if we had access to all of it, which would never be possible. And so for us, the siting and the choice of feedstocks is actually much more about the hydrogen. For every 5 tons of CO2, we need about a ton of hydrogen. Hydrogen is, in its pure form, an energy commodity, and so has significantly higher value than a ton of CO2. And so for us, it's about finding the least expensive, usable mixed gases that contain hydrogen. That's what can make our process go from profitable to very profitable.
So you guys are making this protein powder from capturing these emissions and microbiology, and your outcome, or I guess your product, is a protein powder that then it's not only for fish food, but you're trying to get just in general different markets for animals that need this protein as their feed. I think of protein powder, I think of just like, grab 8 ounces of water, mix it and drink it. Is this a similar way that these animals are eating it, or do you like make it into cubes, or I guess what is the product the animal is actually getting?
Yeah, so as I said before, we need a CO2 source. Let's say in the future, that is the direct air capture, right? The cost of capturing a ton of CO2 from air by a company like, let's say, Carbon Engineering or Global Thermostat comes down to a reasonable price where it's affordable to us. Let's get our CO2 that way. Solar energy improves electrolyzers, which are the devices that can take electricity and use it to split the water molecule H2O into H2 and oxygen. So let's take that as our hydrogen and oxygen source. Then we need some inorganic mineral salts to get our nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, the other elements that are required for life. And then those inputs are basically all dissolved in water in a fermenter, which looks a little bit like what you would see at a brewery or a winery. So there's this aqueous solution, which has those gases and those inorganic mineral salts dissolved. That forms the media for the growth of microbes. In our case, at the core of our microbe consortium of the multiple species or strains that we use are these hydrogen oxidizing bacteria. These are bacteria that actually have the same Calvin cycle that is in the leaves of green plants that performs photosynthesis, but and like that Calvin cycle takes CO2, but it has a different energy source. Photosynthesis uses solar energy, and the Calvin cycle in these bacteria is powered by the chemical energy in hydrogen. So for the same reason, you can have a hydrogen car taking the chemical energy in hydrogen and turning it into kinetic energy to move the car. You can use the chemical energy in hydrogen to naturally power some of these bacteria that have evolved for a couple billion years to do that. And so they reproduce and grow, and they have a very short cell doubling time. The mass can, we believe that we'll be able to harvest about 15% of the biomass every hour. And so you're harvesting the entire biomass more than once a day. And that's in wet form. So you need to remove the water, dry it, sterilize it, texture it, and then, put it in some kind of bulk container to ship by rail, truck, sea freight to a customer. And so that customer would be a food or feed manufacturer. So that whether you're a feed company or a food company, you're in the business of formulating nutrition. So you have recipes, you have formulas to take multiple ingredients and additives and put them together into a particular feed or food. In the case of food, I think you're very familiar with what that looks like. An Impossible Whopper at Burger King, I should say. Impossible Whopper at Burger King, right? That the Whopper, the actual patty component has multiple ingredients. But on the feed side, you're probably less familiar. But the right way to think about it is dry cat food, right? So it's a brown sort of pellet of sorts where there are multiple ingredients. The goal is that it's high in protein because cats are carnivores, as are salmon or Mediterranean sea bass. And the other ingredients are vegetable oils and different products that come from corn or wheat or soy, and then a certain level of fish flours and fish oils. And then it's those dry pellets, the so-called feed, the formulated feed that goes out to the grocery store or Petco if people are supplying pets, or out to a fish farm in a fjord in Norway for that salmon farmer, or to feed juvenile swine at a pig farm in the Midwest, whatever the use of that might be.
You already mentioned that you didn't have to battle too hard to find your CO2 resources, but you also brought up a really valid point that it's not just the CO2 that's the most valid portion of the potion that you guys need to utilize. It's actually hydrogen, and hydrogen, especially lately, has become even more of kind of a precious resource, and it's fairly expensive to get your hands on at this point.
Right. So I think that your metaphor of a battle is a good one to think about. Every market has competition on the supply side and the demand side. And one side is going to be more competitive to another versus the other. And in the case of waste CO2, which is almost all of the CO2, to the extent that there's a battle, it's a battle for who can get rid of their CO2 without putting it into the atmosphere. there are very few promising solutions for taking a ton of industrial emission CO2 in whatever form it is, and even like sequestering it at low costs, let alone using it as a key feedstock for a profitable process. So there's tremendous demand for carbon capture utilization technologies, but the companies that have promise in the area are few, and they're all early stage. One of the ones that has rightfully garnered a lot of attention is Solidia, which can use certain types of CO2 to cure concrete and to embed many tons of CO2 in the material that human beings use the most, besides water, and it'll stay there for probably thousands of years if we understand from the use of cement and concrete from Roman times. So that's a very good one. The economics, I think, are quite different than ours, but it's one of the few that I can point to and say, these are some folks who are doing something right.
I hadn't thought about how the lack of just general technologies for reuse of carbon dioxide might actually end up being an issue. Having more solutions like you guys have, where you figured out a way to reuse carbon dioxide that we can capture prior to flue gas emissions, and that's helped it's going to help develop the carbon capture market, I suppose. I hadn't really thought about how end users could be in the supply chain could be driving the carbon capture market. So that's just kind of an interesting way to think about it. You must be in a very interesting position because you're kind of at the cross section of industrial process and then also agriculture. It's a very interesting place to be.
Yeah, we think of ourselves as a company with three labels, and here in Silicon Valley, folks love to use these kinds of labels. We're a carbon tech company, which means we take carbon dioxide and turn it into a product. We're an agri-food tech company, and we're an industrial biotech company. And so it's at the intersection of those areas that we operate. The story, I think, of human sort of technology advancement, you could sort of simplify into two things. One is like new products, like a transistor was a fundamentally new product. And the other is new transformations. So we started by taking readily available natural things and turning them into products. Like we catch fish and we turn them into, fried fish, right? Or we, dig up iron and turn that into tools. Whereas, that moves on to alloys, and then you have steel, which requires more human intervention. We have aquaculture, and now cellular agriculture, where people are trying to make toro, the fatty tuna belly, without having a tuna fish at all. And so this move from the use of the easiest feedstocks, the easiest inputs for transformation, to ones that are more difficult is what's driven when you have a human population go from 0 at some point in prehistory to ultimately 10 billion at the middle of the century. And so it's increasingly about just using a different set of resources than we had before. And some of those resources are waste streams that we've created ourselves, such as this giant stream of 40 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide that is generated by our entire civilization and is causing us huge problems, but can also be actually like a big resource, not just to solve those problems, but to be a less expensive way of generating the goods that we need.
So don't want to jump the gun and get into future, but right now you provide part of the recipe. Are you guys looking to maybe become a manufacturer as well, or help out with other parts of what goes into the final product?
These final products, to use a metaphor, it's like making bread, right? So for bread, you need flour, sugar, oil, eggs, yeast. So our protein products are effectively the eggs, right? They're a minority of the ingredient, but eggs are more expensive on a per pound basis than flour by a significant margin, right? So that's goal one, is can we take over the egg portion of the recipe, the high quality bulk protein? And then, we also have a product family that's addressing the yeast. The yeast is the smallest fraction of the recipe, but performs a critical function and is much more expensive on a per pound basis than any of the other ingredients. I should probably address, what our yeast product is a little separately. It's not literally yeast, but that's within a product family of low volume, high value products that are made on our biomanufacturing platform. And so, yeah, we want to take a larger and larger piece of this pie chart of the average food and feed formulation. And at a certain point, particularly for feed, because that branding and distribution of feed are not nearly as complicated or important as it is in food. It's a much shorter value chain, and the procurement decisions are much more technical rather than driven by consumer preference. So in feed, sure, we can imagine a point at which we're producing enough of the critical ingredients that it makes sense for us to get into the formulation and manufacturing of feed business ourselves, to buy the things that we can't make, and to take advantage of our significant access to these special ingredients that we make to dominate certain feed markets. I mean, we're going to be careful to try not to compete with our customers, but there will be certain parts of the world where we don't have customers, and those will be the areas where we will vertically integrate and really try to capture all of the value, down to sale to the farmer. And there's also the opportunity to integrate vertically in the other direction, upstream. We don't want to get in, certainly we don't want to get into every business that produces waste CO2, but there are some that are structured in such a way that it may make sense to own those and operate those assets as well. One of those is waste destruction through gasification. So instead of landfilling things, which takes a lot of area and produces a tremendous amount of methane and has other problems, increasingly there have been advances and deployments of gasification technology, which is, I'm not a scientist, so I think of it as a special method of burning that produces carbon solid, which can be used for agricultural purposes as a biochar potentially, and then what's called syngas, which is essentially carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Carbon monoxide and hydrogen can be rendered into carbon dioxide and more hydrogen through a industrial process called water gas shift reaction. So here we have something which can destroy waste, which is a service that has a value, right? The companies that operate landfills and the companies that take garbage in trucks are paid to do that. This is a better way to get rid of that waste and turn it into the two main gases that we need, CO2 and hydrogen. And so in the distant future, for us, a vertically integrated company is one that is performing a valuable service to society by destroying waste, but therefore also supplying, its main input costs for itself, and then going all the way down to, more value add in terms of multi-ingredient formulated products that get sold. Now, I think that vision is, probably a decade or two away. We may end up putting all our effort into manufacturing and not get integrated to that degree. Our main priority is not integration, but replication. We want to get this technology out there and make it as big as possible with a significant number of large plants operating, on every continent besides Antarctica. And as we approach that, we may consider trying to capture more value in the value chain, but that's not the immediate priority, and I don't think we're going to get there in the near future.
Focusing a little bit more on kind of where you guys are currently, as you are creating a product that's helping bolster the fish farming market, have you guys encountered just in the climate of public perception at this point, people are starting to lean more towards, organic foods, clean foods, and we hear a lot in the media about, buying wild caught seafood versus farmed seafood. So have you guys gotten any negative public perception or issues related to that? And then kind of how are you guys battling those misconceptions and about fish farming and what you guys are trying to communicate to the public?
I mean, the first thing to think about is what public are we communicating to, right? Are we focusing on communicating to the global top 5% that has these sorts of interests, or the 95% of the nearly 8 billion people that we have who are largely interested in having healthy, inexpensive, and delicious food? And so that's a critical first lens that you have to put on when you think about these kinds of questions. And the truth of the matter is, we're a Silicon Valley company. We depend on the global intelligentsia to fund us, to write articles about us, it's really, we end up being intermediated to the world through them. So we do have to think about, how the average San Franciscan who shops at Whole Foods makes their decisions. But ultimately, that is not the global economy, and it will never be. So the truth of the matter is that because we address this very large range of nutrition, the individual consumer who is not interested in us is somebody who's not interested in Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, or Morningstar Farms, right? It's someone who's not interested in cellular agriculture. It's someone who doesn't want to eat farmed chicken, farmed fish, farmed shrimp, or farmed cows. So they're probably like a vegetarian who doesn't want to eat processed food. Right. And that's a legitimate lifestyle choice, but it's a tiny fraction of the actual population. And so, I think the other thing is that, we're trying to help some of the more problematic parts of the world food system get their act together. And, fish farming has been an area where there has been bad actors, especially in the early days, right? Folks have been opportunistic and largely, they farmed species that they shouldn't have farmed in places that they shouldn't have farmed it, right? But governments are taking a significant role in regulating that together, and private companies are starting to produce the tools, whether it's new cage systems or new feed ingredients like we're doing, to make it more economically attractive to be a good actor rather than a bad actor in whatever type of agricultural food production that you're doing. And so it's a complicated message, and it's interesting. If you look at the historical media coverage of aquaculture, there's like a 10x factor of media coverage of bad news versus good news.
And this is, I don't know if that's just an aquaculture thing. That might just be in every facet of media type thing. But I'm not surprised to hear that, to be honest.
Yeah, and it's really the problem of being a newcomer. Human beings get used to things over time, right? And most people, for whatever reason, think a lot more about where their salmon comes from than where their chicken comes from, right? But over time, time is the great equalizer. People will ultimately come to view all animal culture as sort of similar, and that there'll be good and bad ways to do it. And hopefully, as individuals and as a society, we're going to gravitate to the good ways. I think ultimately, human beings are going to be vegetarians. The question is, how do we effectively make a transition from a world where eating meat is the luxury, is the sign of a middle class life, is what people have always aspired to throughout human history? How do we create a path to a place where we no longer have to have animal slaughter to support the happy life? And we think we can be a big part of that, but we think that the purists who think you have to stop today are deluded, right? Yes, each individual person can make a decision if they want to stop eating animals today. I've been a vegetarian for part of my life, but it's not realistic, especially to ask the billions of people who are coming out of global poverty and into a working middle class, who are finally freed from basically economic vegetarianism, to say, okay, welcome to the middle class, but we don't believe it's right for you to eat animals the way we have for the last 100 years in the United States. We need to use technology as the solution, and it's going to be many solutions. All the things that I've been talking about will make it economically possible for people to afford tasty food that either has reduced dependence on animals, like fewer wild fish are caught to feed the farmed fish, or no dependence on animals in the case of plant-based or cellular agriculture approaches to making, quote, meat, unquote.
Right. I think that's a really great way to reframe that ultimately your mission is a little bit bigger than just kind of focusing on, the preferences and speculation and kind of new research that's developed over the past decade or so, but it's more so about making food accessible for everybody in an economical way through technology.
Right. So the big challenge for us for sustainability is almost none of the things that we've been talking about. I think we generally have advantage or benefit in those areas. It's about hydrogen production. Today, the cheapest way to make hydrogen is from natural gas, and that produces a lot more CO2 than even we could use given the hydrogen that's produced. And so ultimately, for our greatest sustainability, I'm very interested in what companies and governments are doing to make green hydrogen. that means primarily electrolysis, although there are other approaches. There's some companies that are working on sort of direct solar separation of H2O. These are the technologies that ultimately can make our civilization really green. We can already get electrical energy in a relatively carbon-free way. Can we get chemical energy in a carbon-free way? That's the promise of hydrogen, but it's not realized yet.
David, one of our guests from a previous episode had some emphasis on algae farming and kind of the use of algae and kind of this stock feed similar to what you're talking about here. What are some of the differences you see between maybe algae and kind of the technology that Novo Nutrients is using?
There's much more difference between a bacteria and an algae than there is between, a blade of grass and a tiger. So yeah, it's tremendously different. I think the best way to look at it is actually to look at what is the most successful algae company today for nutrition. And I would posit for a bulk product, which is what's particularly interesting, the best example I think to look at is the joint venture between DSM and Evonik in Blair, Nebraska initially, which is called Veramaris. And that is an approach to using non-photosynthetic algae to make omega-3, EPA, and DHA, primarily for aquaculture feed use. And that's because, when I was talking about what goes in aquaculture feeds, I referred to the protein flour, which is also called fish meal, and the fish oil. The fish oil is really just as hard to replace, perhaps even harder than the fish flour. And Veramaris has a microalgae technology. They do a fermentation, actually quite dissimilar to what we do. It's a fermentation, but other than that, they use some kind of sugar-based feedstock. It's probably based on corn. I'd have to take a closer look, and that would explain why it's in Nebraska. And they basically take the corn sugars and use that to produce microalgae. The microalgae contain various fats and lipids, including omega-3s. And then they have to break open the algae and separate and extract the EPA, DHA, algal oil. And then they can sell it either as a liquid or as an oily powder. Note that their product is not a protein product, and that's because algae are basically not good at making protein. It's an oil product because algae are making oil. It's not a photosynthetic product because although it's sexy to talk about putting sunlight directly in microalgae, that's never been economical for bulk products. So in fact, it's a dark fermentation like most fermentation. And so it's very much sort of an apples and orange kind of thing. I think you will see microalgae companies having some success in the short and midterm for production of specialty fats, basically. But in the long term, bacteria just have a much faster growth rate. It's much easier to separate and extract products from them. And certain varieties actually can produce a significant amount of oil. So I think you will ultimately see microalgae entirely superseded by bacteria, but that's not going to happen tomorrow or even in this decade. And it's a little bit, it's like, why do we eat what we eat, right? We don't eat corn because it tastes so much better than some other plant that was growing 10,000 years ago. We eat corn because it was easier to domesticate and had better, techno-economic characteristics than that other plant that was growing right next to it. And we're going to see the same thing play out with microorganisms. Yeasts have had certain advantages in their ability to be engineered in prior decades, but that's coming to an end, right? And so, as with everything else, civilization is developing these different technology platforms to make things. And yeast has been a platform, microalgae has been a platform. Bacteria is a newer platform and has been behind, but given the state of biotechnology and just general technical capability, is accelerating faster and will overtake these other areas. There will always be, other kinds of production at the fringes, but I think, primary bioproduction is becoming a bacterial game. I looked at a lot of microalgae opportunities in 2016 when I was increasingly focusing on, what was the technology that I wanted to get involved in, and specifically the aquaculture nutrition technology. And none of them made it onto my short list. Ultimately, my short list was a soy technology and this bacterial one. And I think that's representative of ultimately what are going to be the meaningful production platforms. We're going to continue to have row crops, and then microbial production is, I think, primarily going to be bacteria, but we'll see. And just to that end, these very same EPA and DHA that Fairmars are producing, the big ag tech companies, which is to say ADM and Cargill and the like, have been genetically modifying soy and rapeseed to produce omega-3s, and that those things are coming to market soon as well. So it's not clear that algae will be competitive in that future.
So just to kind of wrap it up, 10 or let's say 20 years from now, what ultimately do you want the impact of Novo Nutrients to be, and what do you want your personal impact to be?
20 years from now, when you go into a grocery store or get your Amazon Fresh delivery, I want some single-digit percentage of the food that you get to have Novo Nutrients molecules in it, right? That a product that we've made is contributing to the global recipes for food or for feed that becomes food. And the reason why I think that's possible is because we have a fundamental advantage in production costs for several types of products. And these are products that will be, continue to be or become increasingly important in the world food system. My role is to make sure that we build the team with the best talent and that give them the resources they need to be successful, to provide some guidance so that we stay focused and do things step by step, but also take advantage of opportunities as doors open. And so it's pretty simple, at least in job description. But every day, of course, is much more complicated and harder than that would indicate.
Well, we're obviously really enticed by your mission at Novo Nutrients. We're really excited to see what you guys are going to be doing in the future, and if hopefully, we'll be seeing you guys reach your goals.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in today, you guys. For more episodes, find us anywhere you listen to podcasts by searching Generation STEM Podcast. Hit us up on social media at our handle at GenSTEM Podcast, or visit us at our website at genstempodcast.com. As always, stay curious, friends, and tune in with us next time.